Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Smithsonian Gardens webinar series, Let's Talk Gardens. My name is Cindy Brown. I'm the Collections and Education Manager at Smithsonian Gardens, and it's my pleasure to bring you these speakers from all across the country with all kinds of great information. This year has been exciting. We have shared so many different topics. But we are going to go on a short break for the summer, and we'll see you back in September. So don't worry if you don't get anything from us for a while, but look for new exciting programs starting up September of 2022. I have some surprises up my sleeve to share with you then, but you're going to have to wait to see before I write them up. But as always, please put your questions in the chat box, and at the end of the presentation, I'll be glad to ask our speaker the questions that you are just dying to know the answers for. So without further ado, our speaker today is going to talk about a very interesting group of women. Lots of women, actually, and very interesting. I hope you will help me welcome Meredith Baker. And Meredith is a researcher that has been working on files here in Virginia on Virginia garden clubs. And I think she's going to open your eyes to how important the roles that these women have played throughout our history here in Virginia. But this is just one state. There are garden clubs all over the United States. So this is a sampling. So Meredith, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself? I'm going to disappear. I'll be back at the end of the presentation and we'll start to chat between the two of us. I'll see you in just a couple minutes.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Well, my name is Meredith Baker and I am an educator. I am a writer, and my area of interest is in Virginia history. And so this year I had the honor of being a Virginia Humanities Fellow, and I had a research and writing residency at the Library of Virginia. The topic that I was looking into was Virginia's women's garden clubs. So 2020 was the 100th year of women's suffrage. It was also the 100th year of the garden clubs of Virginia. And I thought, well, I wonder how many of these women who were involved in the suffrage movement became involved in local clubs, and if they use some of this organizational ability that they gained in getting the vote toward making other things happen for their communities through the clubs that they were involved in. And so I started researching garden clubs, and it has been absolutely delightful. I have met the most interesting people. I've been able to dig through unarchived materials and basement collections. I have been able to visit beautiful gardens, and I've also met a lot of women through the archives who have really made a tremendous impression on me, and I feel like it's time that their contributions are recognized. So what I'm going to talk about today are some groundbreaking garden clubs and ways that garden clubs didn't just impact the landscape, but also the ways that they impacted laws, and also the ways that they were involved in women's civic leadership. So this is a picture of my friend Abra Lee, who is also, let me see if I can get my slide to move here. There we go. Abra Lee spoke in a Let's Talk Gardens talk a little while ago called Gardens as Sources of Resilience. And she has a quote that I love. She's a historian and a horticulturalist, and she focuses on women's garden clubs as well. And she says, you get to pick how you join the revolution. And her point is that a lot of women who are involved in garden clubs were also involved in other revolutions, but garden clubs were kind of their way in. Garden clubs gave them the energy that they needed to make the kind of changes that they wanted to see in their communities. And garden clubs are sometimes the vehicle for making those changes. So most of my listeners probably know better, but garden clubs have a reputation, right? Ladies in fancy hats, having tea, judging flower shows. But that's really not the full story, is it? I think that historians who are looking to understand some of the major social movements and societal changes in the 20th century really would do well to sit and look at garden clubs. There's a historian whose name is Anne Fuhrer Scott, and throughout the 80s, she said, historians, look at women's clubs. There's a lot to learn from history about what women's clubs were doing. And specifically in the late 80s, she started calling for more attention to be paid to African American women's clubs as well. And African American women's garden clubs have been very sadly neglected in the research. But I'm hoping I'm part of a movement to try to change that and to give these women the credit that they deserve. So I think that it's time to consider how women's garden clubs played a role in major changes and recognize that they were not simply obsessed with who had the best petunia. So let's take a look at some of the ways that they were involved in making social changes. I'm going to go ahead and introduce some of the groups in my state that played a major role. So the first one is the Garden Club of Virginia. This was federated in 1920, had 8 founding clubs in Richmond. And from the outset, they were focused on good roads, conservation of native trees and flowers, intelligent warfare against plant pests, and the abolition of the disfiguring billboard. They also were major advocates for conservation. And then we have the Virginia State Garden Clubs, which were founded in 1932 as the Negro Garden Clubs of Virginia. They changed names. I see them in newspapers, sometimes referred to as the Federated State Garden Clubs of Virginia. And they were in existence. The last statewide convention I was able to find was in 1992 for the Virginia State Garden Clubs, which at that point had another name, the Garden Clubs of Virginia. And then there's the Virginia Federation of Garden Clubs that was founded in March of 1933. So all 3 of these larger organizations were connected to smaller local clubs and helped to equip them to be able to do the work that they did in their communities. And these women in these clubs cultivated generations of female civic leaders, and they were key to training generations of future leaders in the conservation movement. What kind of work did these clubs do? They challenged municipal neglect, particularly in African American neighborhoods, advocated for sanitation, community beautification. They promoted conservation, they championed native plants, they facilitated conservation and environmental education in Virginia schools. They were part of nationwide highway beautification efforts, and they even undermined segregation. We'll get into that a little bit in just a little bit. But what I want to do is to start by talking about 4 women who exemplified the incredible civic, environmental, and cultural accomplishments of garden clubs. So this is Millie Paxton. Millie Paxton is, you can learn more about her at the Library of Virginia's Dictionary of Virginia Biography. She is an example of the ways that garden clubs contributed to interracial cooperation and undermined segregation in Virginia. So Paxton was a single mother. She was a widow who lived in Roanoke, and she supported her family as a truancy officer. That was her full-time job. She also was a leader in so many community service clubs. It's really difficult to keep track of all of them. She was a member of the Dorcas Bible class at the First Baptist Church. She was a leader in the Virginia State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and she also was notably a leader in the NAACP. It's also worth noting, as an NAACP membership drive organizer in the 1930s, she was the one who enrolled future lawyer Oliver White Hill, who is one of the most prominent NAACP lawyers in the country. He helped to dismantle institutional segregation. One of his cases was part of the 5 cases that went into Brown v. Board of Education. Ms. Paxton is the one who recruited him. And I personally feel that truancy officers would probably make outstanding club recruiters, right? They know how to find people and get them where they need to go. So Millie Paxton gets the credit for that. But it was her involvement in a group called the Ideal Garden Club that helped her to undermine segregation on a person-to-person basis in her own town. So she was a leader in Virginia's Black Garden Club movement, and that federated at the Hampton Institute in 1932. It started with 7 clubs. Clubs in Roanoke were some of the first and earliest members. It grew into 65 clubs in the first decade and eventually had thousands of women across the state involved. And on their 10th anniversary, they published this handbook, a 1942 handbook, to celebrate their first decade. It had a preface by Eleanor Roosevelt in it, congratulating them. And it spelled out 4 values of their garden club association. Home improvement, community improvement, improving race relations, and recreation and creative self-expression. Does that surprise you? This is really an unusual inclusion for a garden club. I've read through a lot of the yearbooks. I've read through a lot of the membership information. And the Negro Garden Clubs in Virginia are the only ones who spell out improving race relations as an explicit goal of their garden club. Well, how did they do this? How did they improve race relations through being involved in gardening? Well, they worked with the, at that point in time, white city council and chamber of commerce to partner in beautification projects. The Chamber of Commerce gave them an old post office building, gave the Big Lit Garden Club an old post office building, which they transformed into a community center. They were very involved with the Garden Club of Virginia chapters that were in the Roanoke area. They beautified highway entrances together. They shared plants. They participated in each other's meetings. So garden clubs were an area in a very highly segregated time in Virginia where women who might not otherwise interact with each other on a personal basis could and did. And so the garden clubs in Virginia and Millie Paxton's club were part of this movement. And just to give a further example, in the garden club handbook, it says, the third value has been that of improving race relations. And wherever a club has been established among the Negro women, the white women in the community have promptly offered their assistance in all phases of the work, from the sharing of the seeds and plants up to getting city and county officials to improve the streets and roads. So they leverage these relationships also to draw attention to the municipal neglect in their neighborhoods and to address it directly. Gardening women did this. Undoubtedly, this is one of the highest forms of interracial cooperation, namely where the two races are working on a common project without thinking about race, but the common opportunity to build a more beautiful community for all. So in Millie Paxton, we see a leader whose commitment to equality was not separate from her love of nature. Beauty and gardening were part of her work in improving race relations, in building bridges, and in changing minds in Virginia. For my next person to focus on, I'd like to look at Edith Sands. So Edith Sands served as the president of the Garden Club of Virginia, and please note the caption underneath her. So I'd like to point out 2 things. Number 1 is, please note that her name is, like many of the Garden Club women, Mrs. Daniel C. Sands, making researchers like me jump through incredible hoops to try to figure out what her first name was. Historians say a no thank you very much to this practice. Anyways, Mrs. Daniel C. Sands is Edith Sands, the 9th president of the Garden Club of Virginia. And as it notes, her bane was billboards. So Edith Sands' major cause was highway beautification, and her story shows the power of gardening women to pass laws and change national conversations about protecting the environment. So in the 1920s, roadside advertising was largely unregulated. Signs cluttered the views and obstructed intersections. Now I have some pictures here from the 1920s and 30s of highway billboards, but they don't capture the sort of ad hoc, cluttered junkiness that was endemic at this time. Imagine no regulation. You've got Burma shave signs up next to whatever somebody hammered on that telephone pole over there. And you've got big billboards and little billboards and hand-painted ones. And one of the major complaints is that they were obstructing crossroads. They were causing accidents. They were ugly. How can you attract tourists to your state or be proud of your town when it looks like garbage at the entrance? So Edith Sands took matters into her own hands, and the story may be a bit apocryphal, but from the book Follow the Green Arrow, which is a chronicle of the early years of the garden clubs of Virginia, they say that Mrs. Sands, with her chauffeur and her axe, was known to stop her car along the way and chop down offending signs. So if you can picture Ms. Sands here, hopping out of her car, axe in hand, and having at one of these little ugly signs over here on the corner. That's apparently what she did. But when not engaging in vigilante justice, she led an anti-billboard campaign that was part of a national organized movement. And it was powered largely by garden club beautification committees. And they faced off against a really powerful business and advertising lobby with deep pockets. The two sides were known as the Scenic Sisters versus the Billboard Barons. Now, the Garden Club of Virginia was organized, impressively so, and they had a very explicitly political, organized roadmap. And I think it speaks to the coordinated suffrage background that many garden club members had. So next to this picture of a shredded billboard that represents kind of eradicate, this is a list that's published in the 1931 Garden Gossip magazine. And this is their billboard action plan. Number one, they're going to subscribe to the roadside bulletin. This is the sort of nationwide publication. Because they want the people who are active in their movement to be informed. Next, they're going to try to actively replace the ugliness of removed signs with grass and trees. They want to work with highway departments, coordinate with them, build friendships, even though it was antagonistic at the beginning, at least in Virginia. And then they want to push for enforcement of existing laws. They also petitioned the legislature to spend certain amounts of money toward highway beautification, to establish state tree farms. Also, they were going around kind of the back door and trying to make rural billboards just plain unpopular, right? Legislation aside, just making rural folks recognize how this scarred their landscape. And then finally, they pushed for legislation to prohibit rural billboards. Now, I think there's if you want to look more into this, there is a good article by Dan Neal in the LA Times in 2004, kind of about the history of this anti-billboard movement. But garden clubs, the Negro Garden Clubs of Virginia, the Virginia Federation, the Garden Club of Virginia, they all collaborated not only within the state, but across state lines with other women's clubs and safety associations to address what they referred to as billboard blight. And it worked. So some places like there's a location called Melrose Caverns in Harrisonburg, Virginia. They had an enormous sign on Highway 11 that completely blocked a vista of the Shenandoah and Allegheny Mountains. Thanks to pressure from these women, they pulled it down in 1937. And in 1939, Virginia Women's Clubs saw the passage of the first Virginia Assembly legislation regarding highways. And in that year, from January to August, 96,000 signs were removed from Virginia roadways. And they were able to establish protections on particular drives so that they would be advertisement free. So their entire effort, it took over 40 years of work for them to petition the legislatures to get the legislation what they wanted. And they didn't get everything that they wanted. They weren't able to eradicate roadside advertising, but they did force the hand of advertisers to regulate signage. They passed road safety and visibility laws, and they also were able to arrange for certain roadways to be advertisement free. They also prevented Skyline Drive from being named Ike's Highway, but that is another story for another day. So moving along, I'd like to point out a third Garden Club member who I believe made really impressive and important changes, and who represents the way that Garden Club women used collective action and the great reputation that their clubs had locally to force municipal improvements, and also to make their local leaders listen to women. So this is Leila Triplett right here, and she has this sort of cute feathered hat on. She's sitting on the ground with a big smile. Here she is with the West Park View Garden Club in Portsmouth, Virginia. Now, Triplett had connections in the Fairfax region, but she spent most of her life in Plymouth, Virginia. She believed in the power of women to lift up their communities by allying with other women. She was a society columnist for the local paper, and she was a garden club evangelist. So you can see her in this picture with the West Parkview Garden Club. She was a part of this club for over 32 years. And in her spare time, she organized an astonishing 75 regional garden clubs in the Tidewater area. One of the things that she did was help to establish Black garden clubs in segregated neighborhoods. And I think she acted as a real ally in lending her organizational experience to women who wanted to have organized garden clubs. And after helping them set up the clubs the way that they wanted, she stepped out of the way, and those women ran their clubs and organized them and ran them in the way that they wanted to. So she was simply there to be a resource for women in her community from whatever race, to help them set up clubs that would better serve their neighborhoods. So we do know one of the clubs that she helped to start was the Community Garden Club. And I have an article from 1958 that I read when she was invited to speak to them. She talked about the number of clubs that she had begun. She talked about garden club history. She also mused about the possibility during this very segregated time of having an interracial friendship garden club, she called it. And it's not clear to me if that ever happened or got off the ground, but this is the kind of thing that she hoped would happen. And she also was known for using her connections, through her society column and whatnot, to raise funds for African-American initiatives and fundraisers. So she demonstrated a real, a very inclusive kind of community activism through the garden club movement. Another thing that she did was show up a lot at the Portsmouth City Council meetings. This right here is a picture of Portsmouth. This is an old redlining map of the area. This is where this top arrow is the sort of the West Parkview area where she lived. And then the Community Garden Club was in this area over here, closer to some of the shipyards. And the red areas that you see here in these old redlining maps, these were the way that the federal government would choose to, they would label different neighborhoods and then as according to risk. And so they regularly would label African-American neighborhoods, no matter the building quality or whatnot, as being of lower value. And so this contributed to massive family property value loss over time, and also was used as an excuse for cities to neglect particular areas. The best areas were considered to be blue, sort of lower down were the yellow, and then the red was considered to be the worst. So Leila Triplett and the West Parkview Garden Club and the Community Garden Club made themselves known at community meetings to advocate for improvements in these areas which were being neglected. So I found a record of the Community Garden Club presence. Now, Leila Triplett, I found records of her showing up to look for community improvements, infrastructure, Garden Week resolution. The women of the Community Garden Club also came in 1950 to express their concerns about their neighborhood. And they banded together with some other groups, church groups, Portsmouth Medical Society. And the reason that they were showing up at Portsmouth City Council meeting was to, quote here, address a few of the deplorable unsanitary conditions in our city, especially where the Negroes live. Large number of streets, the Negro section, have never been curbed or guttered. These streets are the breeding places of flies and filth. The flies that breathe in the stagnant water are no respecters of persons. So then they have their ask down here at the bottom. We're asking you to curb and gutter these streets because we want a cleaner, healthier, and better looking city of Portsmouth. And then they call attention to a few additional traffic safety issues. But I think it's clear that in an era where municipalities actively ignored the needs of Black segregated neighborhoods and often the concerns of women, gardening women demanded better. And women like Leila Triplett and the members of the Community Garden Club show us how women organize to effectively push for civic change and to raise the health standards and the building standards and the sanitary conditions in their neighborhoods. And garden clubs and the organization that they provided helped them to build those connections to do that. Okay, and then another issue that I want to talk about that garden club women were really in the forefront of is conservation, education, and environmentalism. So I think, I don't know, when I learned about Earth Day starting in the 70s, I always thought of it as being kind of a hippie thing and, you know, back to the earth and people with bonnets and long skirts and stuff. Definitely not garden club ladies, but I was wrong. Garden club women have been involved in advocating for conservation education in Virginia since at least the 1930s. So, like other women we've talked about, Richmond resident Adele Benjamin was involved in many clubs. So as a leader of the Camilla Garden Club, though, she brought conservation education into Richmond schools. And she's an example of this commitment that Garden Club women had to conservation and education. So what did this commitment to conservation look like? Well, I have yet to find a garden club that did not have a conservation chair. And conservation is always listed as a founding concern of any major garden group or federation. So decades before Earth Day, these women were writing op-eds on environmentalism that sound like something out of Mother Earth News. Today, and even back then, they'd probably be called alarmists, but they were simply ahead of the curve in raising awareness about the long-term implications of farming and forestry and development practices back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. They petitioned their legislators to make conservation education, oops, this right here, oh, quick pause here. So for example, here is an article from, I think this is, I don't have the date, here we go, 1966, conservation underscored in terms of survival. This is written by Garden Club women. And they also had, you can see here, there's an annual Garden Club forum in the 1960s. It's all about conservation, bringing women from across the state to address conservation issues and to form plans to address the legislature about conservation. But then here is an example of their education efforts. So they petitioned legislators to make conservation education part of the curriculum beginning in the mid-30s. And they sent out these educational pamphlets through the State Board of Education for years so that they could support teachers in having a conservation week focus in their class every year. So this was generally in April. They'd have it around Arbor Day, and you can see all of the groups that sponsored Conservation Week and helped to prepare these materials. So if you're a teacher, you might be interested in seeing kind of what they included here. and a foreword by the Superintendent of Public Instruction. Here is a proclamation from the governor, who is letting you know that he believes this is important. Then you can see the kind of things that they were encouraging students to learn about: marine life and waterways. The women of the Garden Club would provide discussion questions. They would provide some information, a couple pages about the issue. And then they would have suggested activities too. Write paragraphs on our streams and their value to us. Or over here, make a poster or write a play about state forests, or a visit to a fish hatchery, or what would happen if all the bluebirds were killed. So they really equipped teachers to have up-to-date current information and to address some really thought-provoking questions about the environment, beginning almost 100 years ago. Now, and another thing that they did, I think I included it here, but maybe not, were nature camps. They also hosted nature camps for students that were more than just fun in the woods. They also often included scientists from local universities that would teach students real rigorous information about horticulture, botany, and animals. So they were forming and shaping future generations of conservationists through the programming that they offered. Another thing that they did, because what gets kids geared up about something more than an essay contest? Well, they did essay contests for years and years. This is a picture from one of the Garden Gossip magazines of participants in an essay contest that they ran. One thing that is interesting to me when I was going through archives was that in 1937, one of the early years of running the essay contest, one of the leaders in the Garden Club of Virginia said, the only participants we have are from the African-American schools. And those were the kids who swept the prizes that year. And the next year, they also were award winners. So it's important to note that in the 1930s, despite the fact that their schools were so deeply under-resourced and they had a 5-month school year compared to white schools that had a 9-month school year, their teachers were still prioritizing STEM education, environmental education, and scientific knowledge in their under-resourced African-American Virginia schools. And these kids were sweeping the awards when it came to essays. And this picture right here is a little bit of a close-up. So you can see these students created special posters and wrote essays. And in the process, we're doing research about soil conservation and its importance, which was the ultimate goal of these Garden Club leaders. Now back to Ms. Benjamin. How was she involved in conservation education? Well, the newspaper article from which I got this picture is a picture of Ms. Benjamin giving a demonstration to 4th graders at Richmond's Norrell Elementary, which is in Barton Heights. She distributed seeds for them to plant, told them the proper way to plant them, how they could beautify their own homes. And why was she doing this? Well, the Times Dispatch reports many women who feel the urgency to help solve the ecological problem now also feel children should learn early the rules of conservation and beautification as building blocks for the cleanup to come. So her hope was that she could pull young people alongside this effort to conserve and beautify their neighborhoods. And here you can see a picture. They did some trash pickup as part of their activities with this women's garden club, the Camilla Garden Club. So they didn't just learn how to plant and how to raise their plants properly, but they also learned about and engaged in pickup and cleanup activities. And Ms. Benjamin also reportedly taught them the club creed, which was, we believe in trees, God's first temple, in grass instead of ash heaps, tin cans and garbage, and in flowers instead of weeds. This was in 1971. So in conclusion, I want to pull up an article from 1955 that notes how these women brought beauty to the state. In 1955, the Roanoke Tribune celebrated the Negro Garden Clubs. They celebrated their work and noted quote, "The efforts of the organization can be felt all over the state of Virginia. Wherever there are garden clubs, there is beauty." But what I want to add to that is that wherever there were garden clubs, there was not only beauty, but there was growing environmental awareness. There was first-rate conservation education. Wherever there were garden clubs, there were efforts to bridge this sort of segregation chasm that really was a huge feature of Jim Crow era Virginia and caused so much societal damage. Where there were garden clubs, there were women who were making their communities better by organizing and banding together and practicing civic leadership. So yes, garden clubs bring beauty, but that's only one portion of the story. And so I'm hoping that we can expand our understanding of what women did in garden clubs to impact this state of Virginia, but also the other states in which they lived and gardened. It's hard to ignore the significant contributions that they've made to movements in the 20th century, from segregation to environmentalism and other state policies. So often underlooked and underestimated, women's garden clubs in Virginia and around the country did make an impressive impact on state landscapes and laws. And as Abra Lee said, they picked their own way to join the revolution. And for many of them, this revolution for equal rights, to preserve nature, to amplify the voices of women, to bring students along in conservation efforts and in better science education. Those were revolutions that they took part in as members of garden clubs. And so thank you for listening. Thank you for going on this journey with me and meeting these wonderful women that I've so enjoyed studying. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Meredith. That was terrific. You know, deep down, we know that this kind of thing happened if you ever went to any of the garden clubs or the meetings that they have in the area. But it's wonderful to be able to see what you found in history, that these conditions have and these concerns have been foremost in their minds and their clubs since the conception of their clubs. I am going to ask you something because I'm really curious in all the research that you've done so far, because I've been part of public garden groups for, well, since I got into, well, even before I got into my professional career. I'm wondering how often did the garden clubs in Virginia or since you studied in Virginia, interact and bring in public gardens or botanical gardens to help them out with their messaging? Has there been a connection that you've seen in your research to show that they're working together on environmentalism in the past?
Sure. So you're asking about did women's garden clubs work together with local public gardens?
Yes, exactly.
So public gardens were, in some cases in Virginia, developing the same time that women's garden organizations were. So for example, one of, just, you know, for me in Virginia here, one of our major gardens in Richmond is Ginter Gardens. And that didn't become a public garden until I think the 1970s or so. And another one would be the Norfolk Botanic Garden. And an interesting story there is that as part of Works Project Administration program, over 100 African-American women cleared the ground and planted the famous azalea gardens. Now, this was not part of a garden club, this was part of WPA. And those women were only recently recognized and given credit for their incredible work in building that treasure. And what I love as a teacher is the fact that it was a middle school class project that uncovered the history of these women's contribution, and has since resulted in, there's a beautiful statue up there now. You can go there and learn more about that. But anyways, I'm off on a tangent here. But
No, that's
but what I'm saying is that garden club women, in terms of like working closely with these organizations, I don't have a lot of records about that because they were sort of becoming a thing independently of the women's garden clubs, at least in the ones that I've looked at.
Okay.
So yeah, so I haven't seen a lot of overlap. I do know in Petersburg, for example, the women's garden clubs there were responsible for creating a kind of temporary public garden during the Great Depression. So they were responsible for tilling and distributing property for about 400 gardens in Petersburg and unused land. And they managed that program very successfully so that families that were unemployed could have a source of food. And so they basically created a pop-up public garden, for pop-up public food gardens during the Great Depression, as a project that they took on.
Yeah, that's great, because when you think about city beautification and the garden club's effort in city beautification, I just wondered if there was, alliances with some of these new public gardens to really work on city beautification. So more research to do.
Yes.
So
yes.
yeah, always. So do you have a sense if Virginia was particularly active on the garden club front in the 20th century? Or was it on par with clubs in other southern states? So were we leaders or not?
Right. That's a really good question. So number one of the reasons why my focus is regional is because it is a Virginia Humanities grant. So my grant funding is focused on Virginia history. But I will say that Aber Lee has looked into the ways that Virginia garden clubs inspired the formation of other garden clubs, particularly African-American garden clubs, because we're talking that they're founded during the time of the Great Migration. So women in Virginia from African-American communities are leaving Virginia. And as they're settling in Rust Belt towns, or they're moving up to New York or to Philadelphia or whatever, they're taking this club knowledge and the interest in forming garden clubs with them. And so she sees Virginia and Hampton University as being, the place where these clubs were federated, as being kind of a locus, a center from which African-American garden clubs spread. We definitely see that happening in North Carolina directly. Their clubs directly supported by Virginia garden clubs. But Virginia's garden clubs, I think they did a lot of really interesting initiatives, like the Garden Club of Virginia attracted national attention for Garden Week. So they would do historic Garden Week. And so you could come and you could tour a plantation, or you can do it now. You can go see these beautiful homes with splendid gardens. And, back in the 30s and 40s, this would attract people from all over the country. And so I think that while other states definitely had active garden clubs that were involved in legislative initiatives and community beautification, Virginia stands out because of the influence of the African-American garden clubs that came out of Hampton University and their resources as an HBCU with a really thriving biology department. And also because of the sort of national notoriety that the Garden Club of Virginia had as a real leader in historic preservation and using gardens for tourism. So that's why I think Virginia stands out.
Terrific, thank you. Here's another one. Did Lady Bird Johnson ever interact with any of the groups that you presented today? Do you see, or any of the other presidents? Why?
So I haven't looked much at Lady Bird Johnson's interaction with Virginia clubs. I do know that the kind of priorities that she had were those that were shared by the garden clubs in Virginia. And so they would have been supporters, and they are on record. You do see if you look up, people have an opportunity to public testimony about a bill or a pending initiative. You do see garden clubs stepping in on issues of the environment and road beautification that were important and the priority of LBJ and Lady Bird Johnson. Garden clubs are there present, affirming them, sharing testimony, etc. So I do know that they supported her initiatives in that way. But in terms of like personal interaction or visits, I haven't looked too much into that. She's more on the later end. I look a lot at the 1920s through mid 1960s. So she's kind of at the end of that. But that's another area that I love to dig into because she definitely
so much more. Much more to look into. So I think you answered this question already in your past answer, but just to reiterate, the question is, I know you're studying Virginia specifically, but do you have a sense that there were similar instances of interracial cooperation and activism in other states and regions? And you said that Virginia was at the forefront. So do you think that kind of spread out throughout the United States?
I think insofar as the Federated Garden Clubs of Virginia, the Negro Garden Clubs, insofar as those were according to their handbook, which had, interracial cooperation as an explicit goal. The fact that they were the inspiration for clubs in North Carolina, et cetera, I would be surprised if there were not initiatives like that. I do know that a lot of women's garden clubs in the South engaged in citywide beautification drives. So you look throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, if you're paging through old newspapers, you'll see round about springtime, there are these big banners that are across, pick up, clean up, paint up, whatever, and they'll be advertising a city cleanup drive. And these were fairly common. You see them in the newspapers regularly in the spring. And a lot of groups would come alongside to support it from different parts of the community. And so I would anticipate that would have been a way that African-American women's garden clubs and white women's garden clubs during segregation would have partnered together, just because they were rather ubiquitous initiatives, and those clubs would have been in major southern cities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've painted a really rosy picture of positive interactions between Black garden clubs or African-American garden clubs and more provincial white garden clubs. Did you also encounter instances of white garden clubs refusing to work with African-American garden clubs?
So I have not. One interesting interaction that I did read about, though, was in the Tidewater area in Norfolk. White Women's Garden Club was petitioning for a bird sanctuary. So kind of in the Ocean View area in Norfolk, they were making a big push toward having a bird sanctuary. And this was on grounds that the African-American community had hoped to have a local park. And so there's an interesting editorial in the paper, and it says, look, we're all for birds, but you need to recognize that our kids don't have a place to play, and that the only segregated playground that we're allowed is in such a state of disrepair that it's really not usable. So we need the city to recognize, in terms of priority, what needs to come first. And so in this case, it was not any sort of direct antagonism. It was just a cluelessness, right? Mm-hmm. These women wanted a bird sanctuary, which is a good thing, but they were oblivious to the other needs in this community. And so, so that's something that I ran into, and I think is probably a very telling incident about good intentions, but a lack of real understanding of this neighborhood and what they really wanted and needed.
I'd be curious to see what happened. Did it turn
Yes.
into a brick sanctuary or a playground? That'd be great. So where are you finding the information about all the Virginia Garden Clubs? It's fascinating what you're able to find just out of professional curiosity. How do you do it?
Oh, well, so one of the things that's been a lot of fun about this is that there really isn't much written about it. And so I do get to dig through primary sources a lot. And so I can tell you some of the sources I've used. So at the Library of Virginia, they have 4 different garden clubs. You can go in the library and you can look up a particular region. So and this is applicable to anybody in any state. If you go to your state library, some of the garden club records that you're most likely to find would be yearbooks. So every year, women would, in garden clubs, organized garden clubs, a lot of them, would put together kind of a yearbook, would have a list of their members, a list of the topics that they addressed, a list of their major initiatives, their bylaws, any sort of events that they had. And another thing that a lot of garden clubs did is create scrapbooks. So they would have, the old fashioned glue in the pictures kind of scrapbooks. Those are great sources for images and to see what kind of, if you're interested in floral arrangements, what kind of styles were they using? What did their flower shows look like? What sort of community efforts were they involved in? So most collections for garden clubs will have scrapbooks and yearbooks. Personal letters, I found those, and there are also correspondence from club leaders to legislators, from club leaders to other organizations, and meeting notes also. I had the opportunity to go through some uncatalogued materials down in the archives of the Garden Club of Virginia, and they have all these wonderful typed meeting notes from the 20s and 30s, and they detail a lot of information that I wouldn't know otherwise, like for example that the African American schools were the most eager participants in the essay contest, things like that. Those come out in meeting notes and transcriptions of the meetings. And also local newspapers are great. Any of your local libraries will have newspaper archives that you can look through. You can search by keyword because they're digitized. The Library of Congress has a wonderful newspaper collection. So you can look for specific names of garden club members, specific garden club names. You can look for specific legislation that you're interested in. There also are legislative records, national legislative records, state legislative records. You can go and see who's speaking, who's on the highway committee, who is on the environmental committee. And a lot of times those were avenues where garden club women were involved in state legislation and advising on state issues. And then finally, local colleges, HBCUs and extension programs, land grant colleges often had extension programs that would go into communities and they would support garden clubs. So your Master Gardener programs, things like that. Their archives are also a lot of fun to dig through, right? Historical photographs, and also a list of the kind of programs, gives you an idea of what people were interested in, and what club support looked like back then. So any of those places are great to dig in.
Boy, it sounds like a lot of fun, but a lot of work, because we were talking about this ahead of time on how hard it is to search on some records, because you still just have to find the original newspaper article unless whoever you're working with has had the funds given to them to digitize their collections. And digitizing collections is one of the biggest equalizers of all, because then anybody can see, especially if it's put online. Like this is a digitized version of one of our glass lantern slides in the Archives of American Gardens. And we're always looking for sources, funds to be able to digitize our collection, because then people like you or just curious people will be able to find more images and more information out there. So if you're sitting on a pocket of money, any of you, and you want to do some good in history, give money to your local library or your local newspaper, whatever, to be able to digitize this information so it is available to everyone.
Yes, and I also want to add, if you had a family member who is involved in a garden club, and particularly an African American garden club, their records are very underrepresented in archives. And so if you have one of these treasures, you know, a yearbook or a scrapbook or some photographs from a relative, local history museums and the Smithsonian Gardens Archive itself, that's valuable to them. And you don't even have to give it up. A lot of times, if you can share it for a scan, they can return the object to you and then you can share it with other people. So if you are sitting on a trove of garden records, please do consider that.
Yeah, that's what we were making pitches during the pandemic while everybody was cleaning. Don't throw it out, find out if this is valuable or not. So here's a very specific question. Can you talk more about the role of women in African American garden clubs, many of whom were active in the fight for civil rights in combating the U.S. government led redlining and deliberate segregation of housing loans and residential neighborhood policy? So it goes back to that redlining. So do you have more specific information on some of the clubs that were looking at this as a big problem, a big situation at the time, and still
Yes.
is?
So I see their approach as being twofold. So what I see, especially in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, is women, number one, they're advocating in city council meetings, and they are contacting, Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, to make them aware of problems in their neighborhood. So they are knocking on the doors, and they are, first of all, engaged in awareness and making complaints about the status quo. But secondly, they're also filling in the gap. So you see over and over again, who's responsible for the beautiful landscaping at the fire department? It's the garden club women. Who does all the landscaping in that picture that I shared of the tree planting? That's in front of a public elementary school. Who is doing all the landscaping for the elementary schools, for the hospitals, for churches, for highway entrances? It's the Women's Garden Club. So on one hand, they are saying the status quo is unacceptable and it needs to change. But in the meantime, they're demonstrating pride in their neighborhoods, and they're making sure that they are beautiful places that represent the people who live there and the care that they have for their communities. So that's what I've observed in newspapers and in club records.
Yeah, and I could say that that's still what occurs because of all my interactions with garden clubs nationwide. They really take pride in that they are trying to make a difference through legislation, as well as make a difference in their community by offering elbow grease as well as funds to be able to support local initiatives. And they do an amazing job.
They do.
So
they do, and they have for decades. And it's I think they're really kind of their contributions are not properly recognized. They do amazing work.
Agreed. Those gloves have come off a long time ago. So you do it. So one more question. I just had it and I lost it. Oh, for Garden Club of America and Garden Club of Virginia's tradition of activism and organizing continues today. And I think we just mentioned that it does, but do you have any specific instances that you found that maybe something that was started a long time ago is still occurring? The Garden Club Week was a big one that still is continued, and those funds are still used for wonderful opportunities that make a difference in the communities. I think one of the most telling things I found, and maybe you found this too, in the Depression, they were still selling those tickets for the Garden Club Historic Week when there wasn't that much money to go around, but those tours still occurred and the community supported it because they knew the funds were going for great activities for their community. So have you seen it continue as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, the real strong suit of garden clubs is education and equipping. And so if you've gotten your hands on any of the gorgeous publications that Garden Club of America or the Federation of Garden Clubs that they produce, they are loaded with the kind of information that you need to be able to write a letter to the editor, to be able to contact your legislator. They do a wonderful job in educating their members and the public about ways that they need to get involved and concrete actions they can take.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Meredith. It was a terrific look at the past and really a wonderful way to be able to bring a topic to the forefront and to show what good is still be doing out there. So if you're in hesitation, join your local garden club, see what you can do to make a difference in your community.
Absolutely. Join the revolution, right?
Join the revolution. Find, and they still do make great lunches sometimes. So, yes. But I'm very thankful to our audience, again, for supporting us for another year of terrific presentations. And I look forward to seeing you all again in September when we start our new season out again. But in the meantime, you can always watch our recorded videos in our Let's Talk Gardens video library, which is found on our website. And you can always, of course, go out and practice what you've learned in all of our sessions. So thank you again. We'll see you all in September. Bye-bye.